Sometimes, the greatest miracles begin in the quietest acts of kindness. A struggling single dad, a wounded pregnant woman, and a single choice that would change all their lives forever. He never asked for anything in return. And yet, what awaited him just hours later was beyond anything he could have ever imagined. This is not just a story about survival. It's a story about faith, about healing, and about how even the smallest seeds of goodness can bloom into something extraordinary. If you believe that kindness can change a life, and that love often finds us when we least expect it, you are in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The late afternoon sun scorched the land, baking the dirt road into deep cracks and painting the distant mountains in fading shades of copper. Hazel knelt carefully on the cracked wooden porch, clutching a battered watering can almost too heavy for her small hands. She tipped it forward, a few reluctant drops falling onto a wilted patch of sunflowers, or what used to be sunflowers. They had never bloomed, not really. 3 years ago, her mother had planted them with hope. 3 years ago, her mother had died. Graham leaned against the doorframe, watching his daughter struggle with the watering can. The ache inside him, once a storm, had long since settled into a quiet, familiar sorrow. He didn't rush to help her, not because he didn't care, but because Hazel had Margaret's stubborn spirit, and she needed to believe she could bring life back to something. He wiped his hands on the back of his jeans, still dusty from repairing an old fence earlier that morning. "That's enough for today, sweetheart," he called gently. Hazel looked up, cheeks flushed from the heat, and smiled. A smile so much like her mother's that Graham had to catch his breath for a second. "Just a little more, Daddy," she said, determination written all over her small face. He nodded. "A little more. Then we go get some ice cream. Deal?" "Deal," Hazel grinned. Graham chuckled softly, ruffling her hair before heading inside to grab his keys. Life was simple here. Harsh, yes, especially out in the Dust Bowl of New Mexico. But simple. And after everything, Graham had come to treasure simplicity like a sacred thing. The old pickup truck groaned as Graham turned onto the narrow, sun-cracked road that led into town. The radio sputtered static. Hazel sang softly in the passenger seat, swinging her legs in rhythm with the bumps on the road. It was during one of those bumps that Graham spotted it. A glint of broken glass, a battered sedan off the road, half hidden behind a slope of red dust. He slowed instinctively, heart thudding with a strange old fear, the kind that whispered, "This could be bad." There was no sign of movement inside the car. Without a second thought, Graham pulled over, telling Hazel to stay put. He grabbed the worn first aid kit from behind the seat, a habit from a life long ago when he and Margaret had carried it everywhere for emergencies that, back then, had seemed impossibly far away. The closer he got, the worse it looked. The windshield was spider-webbed with cracks. One of the tires had burst. Dust and sand had swallowed half the chassis. Inside, slumped against the steering wheel, was a woman. No, a pregnant woman. Graham swore under his breath and yanked the door handle. It stuck. He kicked it with his boot. Once, twice, until it gave way with a tortured screech. The woman moaned faintly. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, mixing with the dust. Her hands clutched her belly protectively, even in unconsciousness. "It's okay," Graham murmured, more to himself than to her. "I've got you." He moved carefully but quickly, remembering old emergency drills. Check breathing, stabilize the neck, minimize movement. But he couldn't leave her there, not with the sun dropping fast and the desert winds picking up. Summoning strength he didn't know he still had, Graham lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe he was just running on something more primal than muscle now, something that told him no matter what, he had to get her to safety. Hazel gasped when she saw them staggering toward the truck. "Is she gonna be okay?" she cried, scrambling out to help. "Stay back, honey," Graham said, voice tight with strain. He managed to get the woman into the back seat, propping her carefully against a pile of old blankets. Then he climbed into the driver's seat, and the world tilted crazily. He gripped the steering wheel, willing himself to stay conscious. The edges of his vision blurred. His tongue felt thick. The heat. The exertion. Maybe he hadn't had enough water today. Maybe he hadn't rested enough this week. Maybe, just maybe, the years of doing everything alone were finally catching up with him. Hazel's voice floated to him, frightened and high-pitched. "Daddy? Daddy, what's wrong?" Graham blinked hard, shaking his head as if he could clear it by force. He turned the key. The truck rumbled to life. 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes to town. 10 minutes to save 2 lives. Hers, and maybe his own. But 10 minutes might as well have been 10 miles of desert when your body gave up before your heart did. The truck lurched forward, the tires spinning dust into the dying sunset, as Graham fought against the weight dragging him under. They made it to the driveway. Somehow. Hazel scrambled out and screamed for the neighbors, for anyone. Graham barely managed to open the passenger door before he collapsed onto the hot dirt, the world spinning into darkness around him. The last thing he heard before the blackness took him was Hazel's voice, high and terrified. "Help! Somebody help! My daddy's sick!" And somewhere, deep inside the spiraling darkness, Graham thought he heard another sound, the faintest whisper of a woman's voice, familiar and comforting, like a breeze through the dying sunflowers. "I'm proud of you, my love." The whine of tires kicking up gravel pulled Hazel's gaze toward the horizon. Dust billowed in massive clouds, swallowing the sun in a murky, burnt-orange haze. She stood frozen on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her small figure dwarfed by the endless stretch of empty land. Inside the house, the woman Graham had saved stirred faintly on the worn-out couch. Her face was ghostly pale, sweat beading along her hairline despite the cooling desert breeze that seeped through the cracked windows. Hazel's throat tightened. She didn't know what to do. Daddy was lying out there, unmoving, half covered in dust. And this woman, whoever she was, needed help too. For a moment, terror threatened to root Hazel to the spot, but then she heard her mother's voice, faint but clear in her mind, the way she used to whisper at bedtime. "Be brave, my little sunflower, even when it's hard." Hazel ran. She tore across the yard, barefoot, waving her arms wildly as the first black SUVs breached the cloud of dust, headlights glowing like twin moons through the murk. They came fast, too fast for anyone from town. Hazel skidded to a halt, heart hammering, as the vehicles fanned out in a semicircle, engines rumbling ominously. The doors flew open almost simultaneously. Men in dark suits and sunglasses spilled out, moving with a precision that made Hazel's stomach flip. They didn't look like doctors. Or neighbors. They looked like something out of one of Daddy's old war movies. Hazel took a cautious step backward. Then a woman stepped out from the center vehicle. She wasn't tall, but something about her presence, the sharpness of her gaze, the stillness of her posture, made everyone around her seem smaller. She wore jeans and a simple white blouse, but there was no mistaking the authority in the way she moved. Her eyes, a deep steel gray, swept the scene. The battered truck, the unconscious man sprawled beside it, the child standing defensively near the porch. Without hesitation, the woman knelt beside Graham. Hazel watched, trembling, as the woman checked her father's pulse, gently turned his face from the harsh sun. There was a flicker of something raw across the stranger's face. Relief, maybe, or something heavier. One of the men, A younger one with a tight jawline approached her. "Miss Vale," he said lowly. "It's them. They're here." The woman, Ms. Vale, nodded once. Then she stood and approached Hazel slowly, crouching down to the girl's eye level. "You must be Hazel," she said, in a voice that was firm but not unkind. Hazel nodded, not trusting her voice. "My name is Evelyn," the woman said. "We're here because of your dad." Hazel found her words then, tumbling out in a rush. "He's sick! And he saved a lady! She's inside, but she's hurt! Please help them!" Evelyn reached out, brushing a dust-matted strand of hair from Hazel's forehead. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "You're very brave." Evelyn turned sharply to her team. "Secure the area. Get medical assistance here immediately. Now." The men sprang into action. Two lifted Graham carefully onto a stretcher that had appeared almost out of nowhere. Another pair hurried into the house. Hazel clung to Evelyn's hand, not even realizing she had taken it. Inside, the woman on the couch was being assessed quickly. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Hazel watched as they checked the woman's belly with a small, beeping device. One of the men gave Evelyn a tight nod. "She's stable, ma'am. Baby, too." For the first time, a crack appeared in Evelyn's composed exterior. Her hand went to her mouth. Her shoulders sagged with visible relief. Hazel looked up at her. Confusion knitted across her forehead. Do you know her?" Evelyn knelt down again. "She's my sister," she said simply. "Her name is Amelia." Hazel's eyes widened. "And your daddy saved her." Hazel's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and fear. "Will he be okay?" she whispered. Evelyn's gaze softened. "I promise, Hazel. We'll take care of him. Of both of them. And you, too." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the dusty landscape. Paramedics arrived next, called in by Evelyn's people, and soon Graham was being treated with an IV and oxygen mask inside the house. He hadn't woken yet, but the doctors didn't seem panicked, only urgent. Hazel sat on the porch steps, hugging her knees to her chest, feeling utterly small under the vast desert sky. Evelyn sat beside her, silent for a while. Then she spoke, her voice lower, almost reflective. "Your father is a good man," she said. "Most people, they see trouble and look away. Your dad ran straight into it. He didn't ask who she was, or what it would cost him." Hazel sniffled. "That's what Mommy used to say. That Daddy's heart was too big for this world." Evelyn smiled faintly, sadness tugging at her mouth. "Maybe that's exactly what this world needs more of," she murmured. They sat there until the first stars blinked into view overhead, tiny promises against the fading light. Inside the house, in the room where Margaret's old wedding picture still hung above the mantel, two lives were being stitched back together, and one little girl sat beside a stranger, not knowing that her world was about to change forever. Not because someone had come with money or power or rescue missions, but because, in the heart of a struggling single dad who refused to stop being kind, something miraculous had taken root. Something even the fiercest dust storm couldn't bury. Morning broke slowly across the desert, bleeding light into the dust-heavy sky. Inside the small house, the smell of strong coffee mixed with antiseptic lingered in the air. Machines beeped softly, where Graham and Amelia lay resting, both connected to thin IV lines. Hazel sat cross-legged at the foot of the couch, chin resting on her knees, eyes heavy with worry and exhaustion. She hadn't left her father's side all night. Neither had Evelyn. Now, as the first golden rays spilled through the windows, something shifted. A low, rasping sound filled the room. Hazel jerked upright. The woman, the stranger Daddy had nearly died saving, was waking up. Amelia Vale's eyelashes fluttered weakly. Her forehead was bandaged, her skin pale, but her hands instinctively cradled her pregnant belly, as if shielding it from some unseen danger. Hazel scrambled to her feet. Evelyn was already moving toward the couch. "Amelia," she whispered, kneeling beside her sister. "It's me. You're safe." Amelia's lips moved soundlessly at first. Then a whisper escaped. "Evelyn?" "Yes," Evelyn said, voice cracking with emotion. "I'm here. You're going to be all right." Amelia's eyes roamed the unfamiliar room, the cracked plaster walls, the mismatched furniture, the faded photographs, and finally landed on Graham, unconscious on the adjacent cot. Confusion knitted her brows. "Who?" Evelyn brushed her sister's hair back gently. "The man who saved you. His name is Graham. A good man. A very good man." Amelia's gaze lingered on Graham's face, roughened by stubble, lines of exhaustion carved deep. Her lips trembled. He didn't even know me," she whispered. "No," Evelyn said, voice fierce with admiration. "And he still gave everything he had to keep you and the baby safe." Amelia turned her head toward Hazel. Then, the small, wide-eyed girl standing by the window, clutching a worn teddy bear. Hazel swallowed hard. "Daddy helped you," she said softly. "He always helps people." Something cracked visibly in Amelia's heart. Tears welled and spilled over, unchecked. She reached out a trembling hand toward Hazel, who hesitated for only a second, before stepping forward and placing the teddy bear in her outstretched palm. "For your baby," Hazel said, "so he'll have something to cuddle." Amelia clutched the bear to her chest and sobbed, the kind of sobs that come from a soul too battered to contain the gratitude it feels. Later, after the house had settled into a fragile, healing quiet, Evelyn stepped outside with Hazel while the doctors checked Amelia's vitals again. They stood on the porch, gazing across the barren landscape, where a few stubborn wildflowers were daring to bloom despite the dry season. Hazel leaned against Evelyn's side, something she would never have done a day ago with a stranger. "You know," Hazel said thoughtfully, "Mommy used to say that sometimes the best people are the ones nobody notices." Evelyn looked down at her, surprised. "Like Daddy," Hazel continued. "He fixes things, not just cars or fences. Hearts too, I think." The lump that rose in Evelyn's throat was swift and painful. She had spent years surrounded by polished marble floors, high-rise boardrooms, and luxury that insulated her from the rawness of life. And yet, here, in this dusty, broken place, she was witnessing something far richer than anything she had ever bought. Kindness that asked for nothing. Love that expected no reward. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Inside, Amelia had managed to sit up with the doctor's help. Her face still bore the bruises of the accident, but her eyes, once shuttered by years of distrust and loneliness, were clear now. When Graham stirred on the cot, groaning weakly, Amelia's heart leapt. Hazel was the first to notice. She rushed to his side, grabbing his hand. "Daddy! Daddy! Wake up!" Graham's eyelids fluttered open, squinting against the weak morning light. He looked around groggily, at Hazel's tearful smile, at Evelyn standing protectively nearby, at Amelia clutching the teddy bear like a lifeline. What happened?" he rasped. Hazel beamed through her tears. "You saved her, Daddy. You saved her and her baby." Graham blinked slowly, trying to piece it together. Then he managed a weak smile and squeezed Hazel's hand. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." Amelia struggled off the couch, guided by the doctors, and dropped to her knees beside Graham's cot. Her voice broke as she spoke. "You don't know me, but you saved me. You saved my son." Graham shook his head weakly. "Didn't matter who you were." Amelia placed a trembling hand over his. "Then let me tell you who I am," she said, tears streaking her dust-stained cheeks. "I'm Amelia Vale, and because of you, my baby has a chance at life. I can never repay you, but I will spend my life trying to be worthy of what you gave me." For a long, weighted moment, no one spoke. The desert wind howled softly beyond the broken fence, carrying the scent of dust and dry earth. Then Hazel, wise beyond her years, said quietly, "Maybe you don't have to repay. Maybe you just pass it on." Everyone in the room, even Evelyn, blinked back tears. Outside, the sun rose higher, burning away the last remnants of the night's chill. And in a small house forgotten by maps and overlooked by the world, something precious had taken root. A promise made not by blood or duty, but by kindness freely given, and a future stitched together by gratitude, hope, and second chances. The following days passed in a haze of slow recovery and quiet gratitude. The dust storms that had once swept through the Vale property seemed to have paused, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, watching something fragile and precious take root. Inside the weathered little house, the rhythm of life, humble and imperfect, moved forward. Evelyn Vale was not used to this kind of life. She had made billion-dollar decisions from the marble floors of penthouse offices, steered corporate empires with a single call. Yet here, in a place where the roof leaked when it rained, and the kitchen faucet coughed up more air than water, she found herself learning the language of small things. Hazel became her guide. The little girl taught her how to thread fishing line through a broken screen door, how to mend a ripped pillowcase with clumsy stitches. She taught Evelyn how to knead dough with bare hands, laughing at her when flour ended up in Evelyn's hair more than in the bowl. And Evelyn, who had once measured her worth by productivity reports and stock prices, began to understand that love was found not in grand gestures, but in tiny, often unnoticed acts of care. One afternoon, while Graham dozed on the couch with a worn quilt tucked around him, Evelyn and Hazel decided to bake bread. Real bread, from scratch. No machines, no timers, just hands and patience. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves, still stiff and formal, and tried to mimic Hazel's easy movements as they mixed the dough. "You have to talk to it," Hazel instructed seriously, dusting her hands with flour. "Bread knows if you're mad or scared. You have to be nice to it." Evelyn bit back a laugh, but obeyed. She murmured to the lump of dough as she kneaded, feeling oddly foolish, and yet oddly grounded. The warm, yeasty smell filled the tiny kitchen, wrapping around them like an old song. As the bread rose slowly in the oven, Evelyn glanced at Hazel, who was perched on a stool coloring with stubby crayons. "Hazel," she said, brushing flour from her fingers. "Can I ask you something?" Hazel looked up, tilting her head. "What's the best thing about living here?" Hazel thought for a moment, tapping her crayon against her chin. "Daddy's hugs," she said finally. "And when the stars come out. It's like the whole sky is smiling just at us." Evelyn smiled, a lump rising in her throat. In all her years of accumulating things, houses, cars, jewelry, she had somehow lost this simple kind of joy. Later that evening, after the bread had cooled, and Hazel had proudly presented a lopsided but delicious loaf to Graham, Evelyn found herself outside on the porch. The air was crisp, scented faintly with desert sage. She watched as Graham sat on the step, Hazel curled against his side, both of them sharing a slice of warm bread, the stars beginning to prick the indigo sky above them. The silence between father and daughter wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with everything that didn't need to be said. Evelyn realized then that this, not the mergers, not the awards, was the life she had always longed for, but never known how to reach. The next morning brought a quiet milestone. Graham stood, still a little unsteady but stubborn as ever, by the garage door. Hazel tugged at his hand, her excitement barely contained. "You promised, Daddy," she said. "I remember," Graham chuckled hoarsely. "Come on, let's see what we can fix today." Evelyn trailed behind, curious. Inside the dusty garage, cluttered with rusted tools and forgotten parts, Hazel revealed her prize, an old tricycle with one bent wheel and peeling blue paint. Graham knelt slowly, inspecting it. "She's had a hard life," he said, ruffling Hazel's hair. "But I think we can bring her back." Hazel's eyes shone. Evelyn's heart twisted at the quiet tenderness between them. Graham showed Hazel how to loosen the rusted bolts, how to sand down the rough edges, how to wrap new tape around the battered handlebars. And Evelyn, for the first time in years, picked up a wrench with uncertain fingers and helped. Hours later, the tricycle gleamed under the desert sun, wobbling only slightly as Hazel proudly pedaled it, in crooked circles around the yard. Graham leaned against the garage doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with a quiet smile. Beside him, Evelyn wiped her greasy hands on a rag and said, "You know, you could charge good money for work like that." Graham chuckled low in his chest. "Not everything's about money," he said. "Sometimes, it's just about fixing what's broken. 'Cause you can. 'Cause it matters to someone." Evelyn nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. That evening, as the first hints of another dust storm brewed on the horizon, Evelyn found Hazel tucked into bed, clutching the teddy bear she had given to Amelia. "Good night, Hazel," she whispered. Hazel opened one sleepy eye and asked, "Will you stay?" Evelyn hesitated, just for a breath, then smiled. "I'll stay." Down the hall, Graham sat at the old kitchen table, sipping weak coffee and staring out the window. The woman without a name had become a sister reunited. The billionaire without a real home had found herself mending screen doors and baking bread. The little girl with too much loss had found more family than she had dared hope for. And somewhere, deep inside the dust and quiet of this place, something beautiful was mending itself. One small, stubborn act of love at a time. The sun rose slow and heavy over the desert, casting long, sleepy shadows across the broken fences and patches of stubborn grass. The world looked almost paused, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Inside the Vale house, something had shifted too. Something tender and unspoken. It began with a simple idea. Hazel tugged on Graham's sleeve after breakfast, her face shining with a mixture of excitement and hope. "Daddy, can we plant something?" she asked. Graham set down his coffee mug, eyebrows lifting. "Plant something?" Hazel nodded eagerly. "Like Mommy's sunflowers. But maybe this time they'll grow." Evelyn, sitting at the table peeling an orange for Hazel, paused mid-slice. There was something about Hazel's voice, that soft, trembling note, that made Evelyn's chest tighten. Margaret's sunflowers had been Graham's silent heartbreak, standing year after year without ever blooming. Maybe Hazel needed to believe in new beginnings more than anyone realized. Graham looked at his daughter, then out the window, where the hard-packed earth stretched endlessly beneath the morning sky. The soil was dry, cracked in places like an old ceramic plate. It wasn't much of a place for miracles. But he saw the pleading in Hazel's eyes, the same look Margaret had worn once, when she convinced him to buy this battered house, because dreams need somewhere to grow. Graham smiled, slow and sure. "Yeah, kiddo," he said. "Yeah, we can plant something." The whole house came alive with the project. Hazel skipped from room to room, gathering supplies. An old trowel, some mismatched gloves, an empty coffee can for watering. Evelyn found herself drawn in too, laughing as she cleaned out cracked clay pots and searched the shed for leftover seeds. They worked together under the rising sun, a little army of hope armed with shovels and sheer stubbornness. Graham marked out a patch of land near the porch, where the soil wasn't quite as rock-hard. He knelt down stiffly, Hazel at his side, Evelyn handing them tools with sleeves rolled up and dirt already smudging her cheeks. They dug and cleared, breaking the earth open inch by inch. There was something oddly sacred about it, the way the dust coated their skin, the way their laughter drifted on the dry wind. Hazel found a smooth stone, shaped almost like a heart, and presented it solemnly to Graham, who tucked it into the corner of the garden bed like a lucky charm. When it came time to plant, Evelyn produced a small packet she had found in a forgotten kitchen drawer. Sunflowers. Margaret's sunflowers. The packet was faded, almost brittle with age, but when Evelyn handed it to Hazel, the little girl cradled it as if it were made of gold. Graham knelt beside his daughter. Together, they pushed the seeds into the warm earth. "Do you think they'll really grow this time?" Hazel asked in a whisper. Graham placed a hand on her small back. "I think," he said quietly, "sometimes things need time. Sometimes they need the right people too." Hazel pressed her palm flat against the dirt, as if sealing a promise. Later that afternoon, as the first stirrings of a dust storm teased the horizon, Graham and Evelyn sat on the porch steps, sipping sweet tea. Hazel napped inside, worn out from the morning's adventure, a smudge of dirt still on her forehead. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was different now, not heavy or awkward, but warm, easy. Graham glanced sideways at Evelyn, noticing the way the sunlight caught strands of gold in her hair, the way she cradled her cup between dirt-streaked hands with surprising gentleness. "You ever done anything like this before?" he asked. Evelyn gave a small, sheepish laugh. "Not unless you count corporate team-building retreats," Graham chuckled. "I don't." She smiled then, a real one, not the polished, distant kind she wore at press conferences, but something softer, almost shy. "I guess," she said, tracing the rim of her cup. "I've spent so long chasing things that I forgot how good it feels to just be somewhere." Graham nodded slowly, understanding deeper than words could say. They sat there until the first gusts of warm wind stirred the dust around their boots, whispering across the newly planted earth. That night, as another dust storm rolled in, they covered the garden bed with old sheets weighted down by stones, shielding the fragile seeds from the worst of it. Hazel woke briefly when the thunderous wind rattled the windows, and Evelyn was there, soothing her back to sleep with a lullaby half-remembered from her own childhood. Graham watched from the doorway, something tender and sharp filling his chest. He realized, standing there in the shadowed hallway, that the seeds they had planted weren't just buried beneath the soil outside. They were planted here too, in the walls of this old house, in Hazel's hopeful heart, in the space between his and Evelyn's quiet conversations. Small, invisible seeds, waiting. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed raw and new. The earth around the porch was battered, but intact. And when Graham stepped outside with Hazel perched on his hip, Evelyn trailing behind, he saw something that made him stop short. One tiny green sprout, no bigger than a fingernail, had pushed its way through the dust. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Hazel gasped, clapping her hands in delight. Evelyn smiled, blinking back sudden tears. Graham crouched down, brushing the soil tenderly from the fragile stem, and thought of Margaret, how she had believed, against all odds, that even the hardest ground could bloom if you loved it enough. Maybe she had been right. Maybe, in the end, it wasn't about the size of the garden or the perfection of the flowers. Maybe it was about planting anyway, about loving anyway, about believing even in the dust. The desert night fell fast and heavy, swallowing the last blush of sunset beneath a tide of dark indigo. The dust from the storm still clung to the air, turning every beam of moonlight into a hazy silver ribbon. Inside the old house, silence stretched wide, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood settling and the soft, steady breathing of its sleeping occupants. But Graham was awake. He sat alone at the kitchen table, the lamplight pooling around him, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling at his elbow. Hazel was asleep in her tiny room, curled around her favorite teddy bear. Amelia rested in the spare bedroom, her breathing deeper now, stronger. Evelyn had retired early, claiming exhaustion, but Graham suspected she needed time, the kind of quiet a heart demanded when it was full to bursting and didn't yet know what to do with itself. He understood the feeling too well. Graham stared out the window, his gaze unfocused, lost somewhere between the dust and the stars. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to hope. Since Margaret. Since the days when laughter had spilled through this house like sunlight, when every corner had smelled of cinnamon and fresh paint and a future being built, one stubborn nail at a time. He had buried dreams along with her, dreams of growing old together, of seeing Hazel dance at her wedding, of teaching their grandkids to ride bikes in the cracked driveway. He had buried them because it hurt too much to believe in things that could be taken away. And yet, here he was, planting sunflowers again, teaching a woman how to fix a broken screen door, letting another woman, no, a stranger once, but not anymore, sit on his porch and share his silence. The realization tightened his chest, not with fear, but with something achingly fragile. Hope. Real, unwelcome, wonderful hope. The floorboards creaked lightly, and Graham turned to see Evelyn standing in the doorway. She wore a simple cotton robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, softened by the faint light. She looked nothing like the steel-eyed CEO the world knew, and everything like the woman he was beginning to see beneath the armor. She hesitated, then crossed the room, sliding into the chair opposite him. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Evelyn broke the silence. "I couldn't sleep," she said, voice low. Graham smiled faintly. "Me neither." Outside, the desert wind howled softly, rattling the loose shutters. Evelyn wrapped her hands around a chipped mug Graham had pushed toward her. "This place," she said after a while, staring into the dark window. "It's so raw. There's nowhere to hide here." Graham nodded. "That's the thing about the desert," he said. "It strips everything down to what's real." Evelyn turned her gaze to him, something raw and honest flickering in her eyes. "Maybe that's what I needed," she whispered. "To be stripped down, to remember who I was before. All of it." Graham didn't ask what all of it meant. He didn't need to. He knew the weight of expectations too well, the way grief, success, even survival could build walls so thick you forgot what lived behind them. "You still remember," he said quietly. "You just forgot for a while. That's all." Evelyn's throat worked as she swallowed. The room was too full of things unsaid. Hazel's soft cries shattered the fragile moment. Both adults shot to their feet, instincts kicking in. Graham was faster. He reached Hazel's room first, Evelyn close behind him. Hazel was tangled in her sheets, thrashing, her small face pinched with fear. "No, Mommy, don't go. Please." "Daddy, don't leave me too." Graham's heart cracked straight down the middle. He knelt beside her bed, gathering her into his arms. Hazel clung to him, sobbing into his shirt. "I'm here, sweetheart," he murmured, rocking her gently. "Daddy's not going anywhere." Evelyn stood frozen at the door, tears prickling her eyes. This wasn't the polished heartbreak of the headlines, or the sanitized grief of public statements. This was raw. Real. a little girl who had lost too much and lived every day afraid of losing more. Without thinking, Evelyn crossed the room and sat on the edge of Hazel's bed. She stroked Hazel's hair, murmuring the same lullaby she had sung the night before, the one her own mother had sung when she was small, long before life had taught her to be guarded. Slowly, Hazel's sobs quieted, her breathing evened out. Her small body relaxed between Graham and Evelyn, a fragile bridge binding them together in a way no words ever could. After Hazel drifted back into sleep, Graham gently tucked her in. He stood, motioning for Evelyn to follow him quietly back to the kitchen. There, under the dim light, something passed between them. A look, a breath, heavier and more profound than any speech. "Thank you," Graham said hoarsely. Evelyn shook her head. "No, thank you for reminding me what matters." They stood there, two people worn by different battles, realizing in the silence that neither had come out unbroken. But maybe, just maybe, they could help mend each other. Graham hesitated. Then, almost shyly, he reached for her hand. Their fingers brushed, tentative, unsure, then laced together naturally, like a door creaking open after years sealed shut. Neither said anything. There was no need. The desert wind outside moaned low, carrying dust and forgotten dreams across the wide, endless sky. But inside, in that little kitchen with its battered table and chipped mugs, two lost souls found something stronger than the storms. They found each other. The desert was never silent. Not really. Even in the early hours before the sun cracked open the sky, the earth whispered, a rustle of dry leaves, the sigh of settling dust, the faint shuffle of unseen creatures returning to their burrows. But that morning, the world outside Graham's house felt different, alive, expectant, as if something was about to change. Graham stirred first, waking to a strange weightlessness in his chest. The usual heaviness, the anchor of grief, of endless responsibility, wasn't there. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt light. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Hazel, who was sprawled across his lap in a tangle of dreams and faded blankets. Through the cracked blinds, the first pale rays of sunlight painted the world in soft golds and pinks. Graham slipped out from under Hazel's arm, tucking the blanket gently around her, and padded barefoot toward the porch. The door creaked open, and cool air brushed against his face. What he saw made him stop cold. There, in the battered patch of dirt they'd planted days before, the same stubborn ground that had refused to yield for years, tiny green shoots had broken through the dust. Dozens of them. Some barely taller than his thumb, others bravely unfurling their first leaves toward the rising sun. It wasn't just one sprout, not just a lucky accident. It was a garden, alive and reaching. Graham knelt in the dirt, his rough hands trembling as he touched the fragile stems. The earth smelled rich and clean, still damp from the morning dew. The miracle wasn't in the perfection of the plants. They were scraggly, awkward, some leaning sideways, but in the fact that they existed at all. Against all odds, against storms and drought, and the thousand small cruelties of an unforgiving world. They had chosen to live. The screen door squeaked again. Hazel's small feet padded onto the porch. She rubbed her eyes sleepily, then gasped when she saw what he was looking at. "Daddy!" she squealed, racing forward. "They grew! They really grew!" Graham laughed, a deep, rusty sound he hadn't made in too long, and scooped her up. Hazel wriggled out of his arms to kneel in the dirt, carefully counting each sprout with breathless reverence. Behind them, Evelyn appeared, a robe pulled tight around her against the morning chill. She carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee, which she set down on the porch rail when she saw where Graham and Hazel knelt. For a long moment, she simply watched them, her heart full to bursting. Then Hazel looked up, beaming. "Miss Evelyn, come see." They listened. The flowers listened. Evelyn laughed, her voice catching slightly. "I think maybe they listened to you, Hazel." Hazel shook her head seriously. "Nope. They listened to Daddy. He believed first." Graham felt his throat tighten as he met Evelyn's gaze over Hazel's head. There were no grand speeches between them, no declarations. Only a silent acknowledgement that faith, even buried deep and forgotten, could still find its way back to the surface. They spent the morning tending the sprouts like sacred things. Graham showed Hazel how to pat the soil gently around their bases, to shield them from the harsher winds. Evelyn brought out battered clay pots she had found in the shed, and together they transplanted a few of the strongest seedlings to sit along the porch rail. By mid-morning, the front of the house looked transformed. Not perfect, not polished, but undeniably alive. And in a way that had nothing to do with money or power, Graham's little patch of desert felt rich, full of something you couldn't measure or buy. Later, Graham and Evelyn stood side by side on the porch, sipping coffee, watching Hazel chatter to the seedlings as if they were old friends. "You know," Evelyn said quietly, "in the city, we buy flowers already blooming. Perfect ones. Rows and rows of them, all wrapped in plastic and lined up like trophies." Graham smiled sideways at her. "But you miss seeing the fight," he said. She nodded. "Yeah, you miss seeing what it took for them to bloom." She looked at him then, really looked, and felt the breath catch in her chest. Graham wasn't flashy or polished. He didn't wear expensive watches or drive sleek cars. He didn't know how to talk in circles or charm a boardroom. But he had roots, deeper than any man she had ever known. Roots that could survive storms, droughts, and heartbreak, and still find the strength to grow something beautiful. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I think I needed to see that," she whispered. Graham didn't answer in words. He simply reached out and, with a touch as gentle as the morning breeze, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The simple act made Evelyn's heart stutter. She hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had touched her without expectation, without wanting anything in return. Just kindness, just care. It was, she thought, more miraculous than the sprouts themselves. As the sun climbed higher, Graham turned to Hazel. "What should we name the garden?" he asked. Hazel tilted her head thoughtfully. After a long pause, she grinned. "Margaret's garden," she said. Graham's breath hitched. He looked at Evelyn, who nodded gently. Then he crouched beside Hazel, pulling her close. "Margaret's garden it is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And it's going to be the most beautiful thing this desert's ever seen." Hazel clapped her hands joyfully. Evelyn brushed away a tear before it could fall. And the desert, harsh and unyielding though it was, seemed to soften, just for a moment, as if even the earth itself could feel the shift happening in that battered little house. Something new had been planted, something deeper than seeds, something that no storm could ever wash away. The days slipped by like dandelion seeds on the wind, weightless, fragile, too beautiful to catch. Margaret's garden flourished under the care of small hands and big hopes. Each morning, Hazel would dash outside to check the progress of the tiny sunflowers, her laughter floating across the yard like a song. Graham and Evelyn settled into a quiet rhythm, their conversations stretching longer in the cool evenings, their silences growing more comfortable, more filled with things neither dared say out loud. Yet. But change, real change, never comes without a whisper of something harder stirring beneath the sweetness. And soon, the whisper would become a call, It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Hazel was playing in the dirt, her knees smudged brown, her hair tangled into a wild halo. Graham leaned against the porch post, sipping iced tea, watching her with a mixture of pride and worry he would never fully outgrow. Evelyn sat nearby, legs tucked beneath her, scribbling something into a small leather notebook she had unearthed from the bottom of her suitcase. Graham smiled, watching her brow furrow in concentration. "You writing a novel over there?" he teased. Evelyn chuckled. "Not hardly. Just lists." "Lists?" she nodded. "Things I forgot about. Things I want to remember." She glanced up, meeting his eyes with a mixture of vulnerability and strength that always hit him like a blow to the chest. "Things that matter." Graham opened his mouth to respond, but the distant crunch of tires on gravel cut through the soft peace of the afternoon. His body tensed instinctively. Out here, visitors were rare, and unexpected visitors almost never brought good news. A black SUV, sleek and too polished for this dusty stretch of earth, rolled up the driveway. It gleamed under the harsh sun like something from another world. Hazel ran to Graham, sensing the shift in the air. Evelyn stood slowly, her notebook slipping forgotten from her lap. The SUV door opened, and a tall man in a sharp navy suit stepped out. He adjusted his cufflinks, then surveyed the scene. The dirt, the battered house, the wild garden, with thinly veiled disdain. Evelyn's posture stiffened instantly. "Graham Mitchell?" the man called out, voice clipped. Graham stepped forward, Hazel's hand clutched tightly in his. "That's me," he said evenly. The man approached, pulling out a sleek envelope from his inner jacket pocket. "My name's Carter Vaughn," he said. "I represent Vale Holdings." Graham blinked. Evelyn paled visibly. Vaughn continued, oblivious to the tension crackling in the dry air. "I'm here regarding a formal proposal," he said. "Vale Holdings is prepared to make you a significant offer, to purchase your property and the surrounding acreage." He held out the envelope like a weapon. Effective immediately, the silence that followed was deafening. Graham didn't move, didn't even blink. Hazel looked up at him, confused. Evelyn found her voice first, sharp and cutting. "I didn't authorize this," she snapped. "This isn't what we agreed on." Vaughn's expression barely flickered. "With respect, Ms. Vale, this decision was made at the executive level. Your temporary leave of absence has left certain matters needing attention." Evelyn's fists clenched. Graham's voice, when it came, was quiet. "What exactly do you want with my land?" Vaughn smiled thinly. "Development. Expansion. Your property sits on a prime corridor for future projects. It's an excellent investment opportunity." Hazel clung tighter to Graham's side, sensing the danger. Graham stared at Vaughn for a long, heavy moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tore the envelope in half. The pieces fluttered to the dusty ground. "I'm not selling," he said simply. Vaughn's smile tightened into something colder. "You might want to reconsider," he said. "Offers like this don't come twice." Graham's voice didn't rise. He didn't shout. He simply said, "Some things aren't for sale." Vaughn left in a cloud of dust, his SUV shrinking into the shimmering horizon. Graham stood there for a long time afterward, the shredded contract at his feet. Hazel pressed to his side, Evelyn standing a few steps away, her eyes shining with something fierce and proud. When he finally turned to her, he found her watching him the way a person watches something rare and precious, like a miracle you're afraid to touch. "You didn't even hesitate," she said quietly. Graham shrugged. "It's just dirt." Evelyn shook her head. "No, it's home." She stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't know what you just turned down. It wasn't just money. It was security. A future." Graham met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I already have a future," he said. She's standing right beside me." Hazel beamed up at him, unaware of the gravity of what had just happened, but feeling the warmth of it all the same. And Evelyn, battle-hardened Evelyn, who had built empires and survived boardrooms more vicious than any storm, felt something inside her give way. Not break, not shatter, but open. That night, long after Hazel was tucked safely in bed, Graham and Evelyn sat together on the porch, their knees brushing lightly, their mugs forgotten beside them. The stars above them burned bright and wild. The wind whispered through the newly planted sunflowers, carrying promises and dreams and things too tender to name. Evelyn leaned her head against Graham's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed in the scent of her hair and the warmth of her against him and the steady, patient beat of a life beginning to mend itself. Piece by fragile piece, the days that followed stretched long and golden, stitched together with simple joys. Weeding the garden, repainting the front steps, teaching Hazel how to braid wildflowers into crowns. It felt, in some fragile way, like they were building something permanent. But permanence was a tricky thing in the desert. The dust always found a way back. The first sign came with the wind, not the soft, sighing breezes they had grown used to, but a sharp, restless gust that rattled the loose shutters and whipped up spirals of dirt along the driveway. Graham felt it in his bones before he saw it, an unease creeping under his skin. Hazel noticed too. She abandoned her chalk drawings on the porch and pressed close to Graham's side. "Is it another storm, Daddy?" she asked, voice small. Graham looked toward the horizon. The sky had darkened to a dull, bruised gray. But it wasn't just weather he feared this time. It was change. Evelyn was on the phone when the second sign came. She stood on the porch, her back to Graham and Hazel, her voice low and tense. "No, I told you. I'm not interested. I don't care about the board's threats." I said no. She paused, listening. Then, sharper. "If they force a vote without me, they'll regret it." Another pause. "No, I'm not coming back. Not yet." Her shoulders sagged slightly as she ended the call. She stayed there for a moment, head bowed, as if gathering strength. Graham didn't press her. He just stood quietly, Hazel tucked against him, waiting. When Evelyn finally turned around, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but also fierce with something else. Resolve. "They're trying to push me out," she said simply. Graham raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were the boss." Evelyn laughed bitterly. "In theory, but empires have a way of eating their own when they smell blood." Hazel looked up, confused. "Are bad guys coming?" Evelyn knelt to Hazel's level, smoothing her hair back. "No, sweetie," she said gently. "Sometimes. Bad guys don't look scary. They just forget what's important." Hazel nodded solemnly, though Graham could tell she didn't really understand. He wasn't sure he did either. Not all of it. But he knew enough. He knew Evelyn was being pulled back into a world that had nearly hollowed her out once, and he wasn't sure this time she could come back whole. That night, the real storm came. The wind howled like a living thing, slamming against the house, tearing at the loose boards Graham had been meaning to fix. The windows rattled. The garden bent low under the assault. Graham sat by Hazel's bedside until she drifted into uneasy sleep, the teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Then he found Evelyn standing alone in the living room, staring out into the swirling dark. She didn't turn when he approached. "I have to go back," she said quietly. Graham closed his eyes briefly. He had known. Of course he had known. The desert was never meant to hold someone like her. "Just for a little while," she said, almost pleading. "Just to fix things, to make sure they don't destroy everything I built." Graham swallowed hard. "You don't owe them anything," he said. She turned then, her eyes shining. "I owe myself," she said. "I need to know I can walk away on my terms, not theirs." He nodded slowly. He respected that. He hated it, but he respected it. "Hazel's gonna miss you," he said, voice rough. Evelyn blinked rapidly. "I'll miss her more," she whispered. There was so much more he wanted to say, to ask her to stay, to fight for this fragile thing growing between them. But he knew better. You didn't trap something you loved. You let it choose to stay. Or not. Evelyn left the next morning, not in a convoy of black SUVs, not in a whirlwind of press releases. Just a battered old pickup Graham had loaned her, the one with the sticky gear shift and the radio that only caught 2 stations. She packed lightly, a duffel bag, a worn notebook, a handful of wildflowers Hazel had pressed into her hands. Graham stood with Hazel by the garden, watching her go. She stopped at the end of the driveway, hesitating. Then she got out, running back toward them. Hazel let out a squeal of joy and launched herself into Evelyn's arms. "I'll come back," Evelyn promised into Hazel's hair. "I promise." Then she turned to Graham. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the desert wind tugging at their clothes, the sun burning pale above them. Then Evelyn rose on her toes and kissed him. Soft, lingering, full of things too big for words. When she pulled back, there were tears on both their faces. "Take care of her," she whispered. "Always," Graham said. She smiled, brushed her thumb lightly over his cheek, and turned back to the truck. The engine coughed to life. Dust rose in a long, thin trail behind her as she disappeared down the road. The house felt impossibly empty after she left. Hazel cried herself to sleep that night, and Graham sat beside her, stroking her hair, whispering promises he prayed he could keep. The wind died down eventually. The stars came out. And in Margaret's garden, under a sky too wide to hold on to anything, the first sunflower opened its golden face to the night. A stubborn, beautiful thing. A promise that sometimes, even after the dust returns, life finds a way to bloom again. The desert had a way of marking time differently. Days passed since Evelyn's departure, but to Graham and Hazel, it felt like seasons had turned. The house was quieter. Meals were quieter. Even the laughter that Hazel tried so hard to summon sometimes faded too quickly, leaving behind an ache neither of them could name. And yet, life insisted on moving forward. Margaret's garden thrived, a stubborn explosion of green and gold against the weary dust. Every morning, Hazel would run outside to check the blooms, reporting proudly which flowers had opened overnight. "She'll come back, Daddy," Hazel said one morning, brushing dew from the petals. "She promised." Graham smiled and ruffled her hair, but the knot in his chest stayed tight. Promises were easy to make under blue skies, harder to keep once storms rolled back in. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. It wasn't typed on corporate stationery. It wasn't delivered by a sleek courier. Just a simple envelope, smudged with dust, tucked into their battered mailbox. Graham opened it on the porch, Hazel bouncing anxiously beside him. The handwriting inside was neat, familiar. "Come to the old airstrip. Today. Sunset. Bring Hazel. Trust me. E." No explanation. No details. Just trust. Graham stared at the words for a long moment, his heart pounding a slow, steady drumbeat in his ears. Hazel tugged at his sleeve. "Are we going, Daddy?" He folded the letter carefully. "Yeah, baby girl," he said, scooping her up into a hug. "We're going." The old airstrip sat about 5 miles outside town, a flat, cracked expanse of asphalt and weeds, long abandoned to the desert wind. Graham parked the truck at the edge and climbed out, Hazel scampering ahead of him, her sundress whipping in the breeze. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the crumbling runway. For a few heartbeats, there was nothing, just the hum of insects and the distant whisper of a coming storm. Then Graham heard it, the low, rumbling growl of an engine. He turned, shielding his eyes against the glare. A dust cloud rose in the distance. Out of it came Evelyn, not in a sleek black car, not in designer heels. Just her, driving the battered old pickup he had loaned her, her hair blowing wild and free, a wide grin splitting her face. Graham's heart lifted, impossibly light. She skidded to a stop in front of them, throwing the truck door open and jumping out. Hazel shrieked with joy, launching herself into Evelyn's arms. Evelyn laughed, spinning the little girl around before setting her down gently. Then she straightened, her gaze locking with Graham's. In her hand, she held a small, crooked bouquet, wildflowers and a single stubborn sunflower, tied together with a fraying piece of twine. She walked toward him without hesitation, the wind tugging at her dress, the storm brewing behind her like a dark, glorious banner. When she stood before him, she thrust the bouquet into his chest almost fiercely. "I'm not going back," she said, breathless. "I sold my shares. I walked away. It's done." Graham stared, stunned. You gave it all up?" She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "It wasn't mine anymore. It stopped being mine a long time ago. But this..." She gestured around them, at the cracked earth, the wildflowers, the tiny, stubborn life they had built. "This is where I belong." Graham opened his mouth, but no words came. So Evelyn took a breath, squared her shoulders, and kept going. "I love you, Graham Mitchell," she said, voice trembling but strong. "I love Hazel. I love this broken-down house, and this stubborn desert, and this life that doesn't come wrapped in a bow." The wind roared louder, carrying the first sharp taste of rain. Behind them, lightning forked across the sky. Hazel squealed and twirled, delighted by the sudden wildness in the air. Graham felt something inside him break and heal all at once. He dropped the bouquet, reached for Evelyn, and kissed her hard, pulling her against him like he was anchoring himself to something real for the first time in years. She kissed him back just as fiercely, just as desperate and sure. When they finally pulled apart, laughing and breathless, Hazel clapped her hands. "Does this mean we're a family now?" she cried. Graham laughed through the tightness in his throat. "Yeah, baby girl," he said, scooping Hazel up in one arm and wrapping the other around Evelyn. "It means we're a family." The first fat drops of rain splattered against the cracked runway, but they didn't run for cover. They stood together, arms around each other, faces lifted to the sky. Let the storm come, Graham thought. Let it rage and roar. They were ready, stronger together, rooted deep. That night, back at the house, Evelyn sat cross-legged on the living room floor with Hazel, helping her draw pictures of their new life. Graham watched them, heart full to bursting, and thought of Margaret, how she had always believed in planting hope, even in the driest places. He smiled, lifting Hazel's wildflower crown onto Evelyn's head, earning a delighted squeal from both girls. Outside the window, Margaret's garden swayed in the rain, golden and stubborn and full of promise. Tomorrow would bring more storms, more dust, more fights to survive. But tonight they had each other, and that was enough. More than enough. Spring came to the desert like a whispered promise, cautious, tentative, as if unsure it would be welcomed. But in Graham's little corner of the world, it was greeted with open arms. Margaret's garden exploded into life. Sunflowers stretched tall and defiant against the endless blue sky. Wild daisies, Seeds blown in by the storms unfurled their white petals along the fence line, delicate but fierce in their stubborn beauty. The house, once battered and silent, now rang with laughter and music and the sweet clatter of everyday life. It wasn't perfect. There were broken hinges and leaky pipes, forgotten chores, and muddy footprints tracked through the kitchen. But it was real. It was home. On the first truly warm Saturday of the season, they decided to celebrate. No invitations were sent. No fancy decorations. Just neighbors, friends, and anyone who'd ever wandered past and found a reason to stay. Tables made from sawhorses and old doors lined the yard, covered with mismatched quilts. Plates of fried chicken, bowls of potato salad, pitchers of sweet tea and lemonade crowded every surface. Children ran barefoot through the dust, shrieking with joy. Old men played harmonicas on the porch, tapping their boots in lazy rhythm. And in the middle of it all, Graham, Evelyn, and Hazel moved like planets around one another, always close, always orbiting the same sun. Hazel wore a white dress that Evelyn had stitched herself, slightly crooked, but perfect in all the ways that mattered. Her hair was a halo of loose curls, crowned with a ring of daisies she and Evelyn had woven together that morning. Evelyn wore simple jeans and a soft blue blouse, her feet bare, her laughter ringing out as she chased Hazel around the garden beds. And Graham wore a worn button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sunburn pinking the back of his neck. He had never felt richer, never felt more like the man Margaret had once believed he could be. As the sun dipped low, bathing everything in molten gold, Evelyn found him sitting alone at the edge of the garden. She sat down beside him, their shoulders brushing. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a silver ring, simple and unadorned, except for a tiny sunflower etched into the band. She turned it over in her fingers before slipping it into Graham's calloused hand. "No speeches," she said quietly. "No big declarations. Just, yes, today, tomorrow, every dusty, beautiful day after that." Graham swallowed hard. He looked at the ring, at Evelyn, at Hazel, twirling barefoot with the other children, her laughter lighting up the coming twilight. He closed his fingers around the ring. "I reckon," he said, his voice thick, "this might be the best business deal I've ever made." Evelyn laughed, a tear slipping down her cheek. Without ceremony, without pretense, they stood. Graham slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Hazel spotted them from across the yard and whooped with delight, racing toward them. "Are we getting married?" she cried, breathless. Graham and Evelyn looked at each other, smiling. "Already are," Graham said, lifting Hazel into his arms. "In all the ways that matter." Hazel threw her arms around both of them, squeezing tight. Later that night, after the last guest had wandered off, after the dishes were piled high in the sink and the guitars had gone silent, they sat together on the porch. The air smelled of earth and flowers and a lingering trace of wood smoke. Above them, the stars blazed bright and wild. Hazel slept sprawled across Evelyn's lap, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. Graham leaned back, hands clasped behind his head, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. For a long time they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything important had already been said, in the planting of seeds, in the fixing of broken fences, in the mending of hearts. Evelyn looked out at the garden, at the sea of sunflowers and daisies swaying under the night breeze. She smiled. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think power was measured by how much you could control, how many people answered to you, how big your name looked on a building." Graham turned his head, waiting. "But out here," Evelyn's voice grew thick with emotion, "it's measured in smaller things. The way you teach a child to trust again. The way you fix something broken without asking for thanks. The way you love without needing the whole world to notice. Graham reached over and took her hand. We measure it in how well you grow, he said simply. Evelyn nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. And somewhere beyond the porch, beyond the battered fence and the dusty road, and the reach of all the things they had once thought important, the daisies bloomed, white and stubborn and perfect, born of dust, rooted in hope, thriving because someone believed they could. In a corner of the porch, nailed to the railing where the sun could warm it every morning, a small hand-painted sign swung gently in the breeze. Margaret's Garden. It read in Hazel's careful handwriting. But now it was more than a memory. It was a beginning. A home stitched together from love and second chances. A life that would keep blooming, no matter how many storms tried to tear it down. We'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Share your city or country in the comments below. It always warms our hearts to see how far these stories travel and how many wonderful souls they reach. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share inspiring stories like this one every week, little reminders that kindness, hope, and love are still alive in this world. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Your support means more than words can say. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep believing in the power of good things.